Hello, friends. We are used to thinking that history is written by great strategies and brilliant plans. But in reality, it is often shaped by mistakes, laziness, and absolute crystal clear absurdity. You see, life is the best screenwriter, sometimes with a very peculiar sense of humor. Today, you will learn about the Lord Pretender Timothy Dexter, who, against all logic, made a fortune selling warming pans in the tropics and coal to mining towns. We will talk about the richest person in history, Mansa Musa, whose extraordinary generosity led to an economic apocalypse for an entire continent, and how an ordinary Cambridge kettle became the world's first internet star, simply because programmers were too lazy to get out of their chairs. Before we begin, in our lovely tradition, please post a like and write in the comments what city you are listening from. For you, it is just one click, but for us, it is a huge help in promoting the video. So, pour yourself some coffee, get comfortable. We are about to dive into incredible stories. Let's go. Story number 1. The philosopher who sold coal to miners and cats to paradise. You know that feeling when you do something foolish and it turns into a disaster? Well, forget that. Today we will talk about a person whose foolishness was so monumental that the universe seems to have just thrown up its hands and thought, all right, let him be lucky. Let's travel back to the end of the 16th century in the state of Massachusetts. In the city of Newburyport lives a certain Timothy Dexter, a tanner, a man with an education equivalent to 2 grades of a church-run school and ambitions of a Roman emperor. He married well, got some money, bought a mansion, and decided he was now a lord. The local elite, all stuffy gentlemen, did not particularly like him. Timothy was loud, illiterate, and odd, and they decided to play a cruel joke on him. They started giving him friendly business advice, hoping that Dexter would go bankrupt and disappear from their class. Imagine the scene. A group of wealthy merchants with serious faces tells Timothy, "Hey friend, right now the golden opportunity is shipping warming pans to the Caribbean. Warming pans to the Caribbean! In the tropics, where it's so hot that asphalt would melt if it were there, that would be like selling ice to Eskimos." But Timothy nodded, bought 40,000 warming pans, which were actually pans with lids used to put in coals, and sent a ship south. The merchants rubbed their hands together, anticipating the downfall of this upstart. But when the ship arrived at the islands, what do you think happened? The captain was, of course, met with skepticism. "Warm beds? Are you out of your mind?" But then a local planter, looking at the warming pan, thoughtfully said, "This is actually the perfect scoop for molasses." It turned out that the long handle and deep container were just what was needed for pouring boiling sugar. The entire batch was sold out in a few days at a huge markup. Timothy became even richer. The envious ones ground their teeth. They said, "All right, send coal to Newcastle." This was an English idiom meaning a pointless endeavor, as Newcastle was the center of coal mining in England. Transporting coal there is like carrying wood into the forest. Timothy, unaware of idioms, charters ships, fills them to the brim with coal, and sends them to England. The irony of fate reached a new level. At the exact moment when Dexter's ships arrived at the port of Newcastle, a large-scale miners' strike broke out. Mining came to a halt and the city froze. Dexter's coal became the only salvation and was sold for a price of gold. It seemed his luck was infinite. He was advised to gather all the stray cats in the city and send them to the islands. He did just that, trapping hundreds of cats. The city breathed a sigh of relief, freed from the noise, while Dexter sent off the fluffy cargo. And once again, bingo! On the islands where the ship arrived, warehouses were suffering from a rat invasion. The cats were welcomed as heroic saviors. Eventually, Timothy decided to become a writer. He published a book titled Nonsense for the Wise, in which he recounted his greatness. It had not a single comma or period, just a stream of consciousness spanning 33 pages. When readers began to complain that the text was unreadable, Dexter added an entire page at the end of the second edition, filled solely with punctuation marks, and noted, "Season the text to your taste." Timothy Dexter died a fabulously wealthy man, never realizing that people laughed at him. Or maybe he was laughing at everyone. After all, winners are never judged, especially when Lady Luck is on their side. By the way, friends, for the most curious, I've left links to all the original sources in the description. Take a look while we continue. Story number 2. A genius who could read minds but couldn't count. Let's transport ourselves to Berlin at the beginning of the 20th century, a time of gas lamps, monocles, and faith that science would soon explain everything. Now imagine a crowd gathering in one of the cobbled courtyards. People are holding their breath. In the center stands a chalkboard, and in front of it is not a professor with glasses, but a horse, a regular Arabian trotter named Hans. Next to him is his owner, former school teacher Wilhelm von Osten. The teacher takes chalk and writes on the board, "What is the square root of 16?" Silence. Only the distant sound of a carriage can be heard. Hans raises a hoof. Tap, 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 4 times. The crowd erupts into applause. This was not a circus trick. Clever Hans, as the newspapers called him, could add, subtract, multiply, divide, and even work with fractions. If you asked him, if the first Tuesday of the month falls on the 8th, what day will it be the following Friday? He would tap out the correct answer. He could distinguish colors, the pitch of musical chords, and could tap out the names of the people present, letter by letter. The whole world went crazy. Were animals rational all this time, just hiding it? The most astonishing part was that von Osten was not a charlatan. He didn't charge money for the performance. He sincerely believed that he had taught his horse mathematics. Furthermore, when people asked the owner to step aside or even leave the courtyard, Hans continued to answer questions correctly from complete strangers. Skeptics were furious. In 1904, a special commission for Hans was formed. It included the circus director, veterinarians, officers, and even the director of the Berlin Institute of Psychology. They checked everything. Secret signals? No. Hidden magnets? No. Training with food? Also not the case. The commission reluctantly released a report. There is no trick. The horse actually thinks. It seemed that biology textbooks would have to be rewritten, but then a young psychologist named Oscar Funkst stepped onto the scene. He was meticulous and did not believe in miracles. Oscar noticed one strange detail. Hans could answer a question only if the questioner knew the correct answer. If a person was shown a card with a number, ensuring the horse could not see it, and asked what was written on it, Hans would start tapping his hoof helplessly without stopping. Funkst conducted an experiment that would enter the history of science. He covered Hans's eyes so that he could not see people, and the magic disappeared. It turned out that Hans did not know math. He knew people. This horse was a brilliant observer. When a person was asked how much 2 plus 3 was, the person would involuntarily tense up. They would lean slightly forward, awaiting the answer. Hans would begin to tap. 1, 2, 3, 4. As he approached the number 5, the person's tension grew, and on the count of 5, they would subtly exhale, relax their shoulders, or slightly lift their heads, pleased to know the answer was correct. Hans picked up on this microscopic movement that even the people themselves did not notice and immediately stopped tapping. He read body language with the accuracy of a lie detector. He calculated the answer by observing the eyebrows, the corners of the mouth, and the posture of the questioner. This was a disappointment for the audience, but a triumph for science. Hans turned out to be even smarter than they thought. He couldn't count, but he could see right through people. So next time your dog or cat looks at you with that knowing gaze, don't be quick to dismiss it. Perhaps they know more about you than you do yourself. Story number 3. The Waffle Revolution, or how Assyrian bread saved the world's coldest treat. Have you ever wondered how great discoveries sometimes happen simply because someone ran out of dishes? Seriously, picture this. Summer, heat, crowds of people, and complete chaos. Let's transport ourselves to 1904, St. Louis, Missouri. There, a World's Fair was taking place. It was monumental. The scale was incredible. People came from all over the world to see new machines, electricity, and other marvels of technology. But, honestly, most of them just wanted something to drink and a little treat. The heat was such that the air seemed to be sliceable with a knife. In one of the pavilions stood an ice cream vendor named Arnold Fornacho. His business was thriving, simply amazing. The line stretched for hundreds of meters. Everyone wanted his cool treat. But there was one problem, a small technical issue. Arnold served ice cream in small glass bowls, and they ran out. Imagine his panic. People stood with money, the ice cream was melting, and there was nowhere to put it. Dishwashers couldn't keep up, and the little vases simply weren't returning clean. Arnold was already ready to close his shop and escape from the furious crowd. But then, wait a minute, things were a bit different. Next to Arnold stood another merchant, a Syrian named Ernest Hamwi. He was selling zalabia. These are thin, crispy waffles that resemble flatbreads. And here's the paradox. Ernest was having a really tough time. Who would want to eat a hot waffle in 40-degree heat? Nobody. He stood there, sadly looking at his piles of unused dough. Ernest glanced at the sweating Arnold. Arnold looked at the empty hands of the customers. And then, a spark. Ernest grabbed his hot waffle, twisted it into a cone right with his hands, and handed it to his neighbor. "Here," he said, "put your ice cream in here." This was a moment of triumph. The ice cream nestled into the crispy cone. It didn't melt in their hands, it soaked into the waffle. And most importantly, there were no dishes to wash. You could eat it. The crowd froze. One bite, another, and it took off. In an hour, the whole exhibition was walking around with these edible cones. People were throwing away their spoons. It was a true revolution. Without blueprints, without patents, just two neighbors decided to help each other in a tough moment. By the end of the exhibition, several thousand cones had been sold. That's how, thanks to an accidental partnership and the lack of dishes, we got the most popular dessert format in history. And you know what's the funniest part? Arnold and Ernest never actually managed to agree on who really came up with the idea, but what difference does it make to us, right? The important thing is that now we have a waffle cone. So, do you feel the crunch of that crispy shell? This is just the beginning, because sometimes, to change the world, all you need to do is fold a flatbread at just the right moment. Story number 4. Iron riders who traded horses for spokes. Listen, have you ever tried riding a bicycle through mud? Not the kind you find in a park after a light rain, but real, thick muck that sucks your wheels in up to the hubs. Now imagine your bicycle doesn't have any gears at all. It's a heavy steel frame weighing nearly 40 pounds, and you have just as much gear on your back. Can you picture it? Then welcome to the year 1997. In those days, the world was going crazy over bicycles. It was a craze more intense than today's hype around neural networks. But military folks are conservative. They believed in horses. A horse, that's clear. A horse is tradition. But one young lieutenant named James Moser decided it was time to move tradition aside a bit. He proposed a crazy idea of creating a bicycle corps. Why feed a horse if you can simply pedal? So, 25 soldiers from the 25th Infantry Regiment of the state of Montana lined up on the parade ground. Look at them. They're sturdy guys. They were dubbed Iron Riders. But it wasn't just them who were iron. Their horses were too. No shock absorbers, no inflatable tires as we know them. Narrow seats that make you want to walk for the rest of your life after just an hour of riding. Their mission was to travel from Fort Missoula to St. Louis. It is almost 3,000 kilometers. Through the mountains, across the sand, over rivers where there were not even any bridges. Honestly, even now in a modern off-road vehicle, this journey seems like an adventure. Back then, imagine that the road was merely a direction, scattered with sharp stones and thorns. They set off in June, and almost immediately the challenges began. The rain turned the trails into a sticky mess. The soldiers weren't riding bicycles, they carried them on their backs, kilometer by kilometer. 40 pounds of steel on their shoulders, rifles on their backs, food, and tents. Then came the heat. Water was scarce in those regions. Sometimes they had to drink from filthy puddles, straining the water through handkerchiefs, but they didn't stop. You know what's remarkable? The rhythm. They rode for 10 to 12 hours a day, with wheels breaking, and they did break constantly. They fixed them right in the field, on their knees. Spokes flew out, chains broke, tires ripped to shreds, but Lieutenant Moss led them forward. By the way, when they passed through small towns, the locals ran into the streets. They had never seen anything like it. 25 people on strange iron contraptions, dusty, exhausted, but moving with alarming precision. It looked like an alien invasion. After 41 days, they arrived in St. Louis, dirty, emaciated, but they made it. They outpaced the cavalry on the same stretches of road. It turned out that a bicycle doesn't require oats, doesn't get sick, and doesn't need to be tied up at night. Moss was ecstatic. He proved his point. But wait, it didn't end the way he expected. The military leadership looked at the reports, scratched their heads, and said, "Impressive, but let's stick with horses. They're somehow more familiar." The project was shut down, the bicycles submitted to storage. And yet, this trek remains in history as one of the most incredible examples of human endurance. Without a single motor, without a navigator, just relying on willpower and steel pedals. When you look at their photographs, you understand that these people were made of the same metal as their frames. So, what do you think of such a journey? After this, any commute to work seems like an easy cruise, right? And as it turns out, in our archives there are stories about those who solved problems in even more elegant ways. Story number 5. The man who hugged a dinosaur. Listen, do you believe in friendship? No, not the kind where you just go to the movies together or have coffee on Saturdays. I'm talking about a connection that breaks all the laws of nature, a friendship that makes biologists scratch their heads and say, "This just can't be." Imagine the jungles of Costa Rica, 1989, on the banks of the Ipiquara River. A local fisherman named Gilberto Achedem, everyone called him Chita, was walking along the shore when he stumbled upon, let's say, a gigantic problem. There lay a 5-meter crocodile, enormous, weighing 450 kilograms, covered in scales, with teeth and primal fury. But there was no fury at all. The reptile was extremely weak, barely breathing. Anyone else in Cheetah's shoes would have run off so fast their heels would have shown. Or, well, called someone with a gun. But Cheetah was different. He looked into that yellow eye and saw not a predator, but a living creature that was suffering greatly, and he decided to save it. Listen, it sounds crazy, I know. Imagine him dragging this giant into the boat, bringing it home. Cheetah settled the crocodile in a pond next to his house, naming it Pocho. And then the strangest thing began. Cheetah fed him fish and chicken. He slept next to him on the sand. He even petted him. His wife, by the way, was not thrilled. "Well, you understand, right, dear? I brought home a 5-meter dinosaur. He'll live in our garden." Pure surrealism. After 6 months, Pocho grew stronger. He became that same hunting machine again. Cheetah decided it was time to say goodbye. He took the crocodile to the river, released him, and said, "Live, buddy, be free." He turned around and went home. And now there's a pause. Silence. The next morning, Cheetah steps out onto the porch, stretches, looks at the pond, and there lies Pocho. He swam a few shallows behind the boat, crawled onto the shore, and returned to the man. He simply didn't want to leave. And so it went on for 20 years. 20 years. They became a legend. Imagine the scene. Cheetah jumps into the water, and the huge crocodile doesn't lunge at him to bite his leg, but starts to play. Pocho swirled around him, closed his mouth when Cheetah swam close, and allowed the man to hug him around the neck. Scientists from around the world flew to Costa Rica. They watched and said, "This is impossible. Reptiles' brains are not wired for attachment. It's just the instinct of satiety." But Cheetah just laughed. He said, "If I call him by name, he will come. If I want to play, he will play." Pocho even learned a few commands. He was like a huge, very toothy dog. When Cheetah was in the water and splashed the surface, Pocho swam to him across the entire pond, presenting his head for petting. It was truly beautiful. Two creatures from entirely different worlds found a common language without words, without training, simply based on the trust that began with one kind deed by the riverbank. Their friendship lasted until the deepest old age of Pocho. It was the longest and most incredible bond between a man and a predator that this world has ever seen. So, how do you like the scale of that trust? Sometimes it seems like we know everything about nature. And then, one fisherman from Costa Rica turns everything upside down. Speaking of people who can do the impossible, there's a story about a guy who decided that the sky is not the limit, even if all you have in your hands is a thread. Story number 6. The house that grew from a single paperclip. Listen, what's on your desk right now? Well, besides your phone or cup of tea, maybe some small change, an old coin, the cap from a pen, or an ordinary paperclip? A red, tiny one. Completely useless if you don't need to clip a couple of sheets together. We often think that big accomplishments require huge capital, connections, or at least a plan to take over the world. But sometimes all it takes is just the internet and a whole lot of optimism. Let's transport ourselves to 2005, Montreal. A young man named Kyle McDonald sits in front of his computer. He is unemployed. Well, to be precise, he has a side gig, but it's clearly not enough for his dream home. In front of him lies a red paperclip, and then a wild thought hits him, one of those ideas that usually fades away 5 minutes after waking up. He decides to test the theory of bartering. Can he trade one small item for something bigger, and then something else, and keep going potentially forever? Kyle goes online to a classifieds website. He types, "I have a red paperclip. I want to exchange it for something else. I don't care what." Do you think people laughed at him? Of course. But just a few days later, 2 women from Vancouver offered him a trade. The paperclip was gone. In exchange, Kyle received a wooden, fish-shaped pen. Well, progress, wouldn't you agree? The fish is certainly more impressive than a piece of wire, but from there, everything turned into a surreal series of exchanges. On the same day, he traded the pen for a homemade door handle shaped like a funny face. Then he traveled to another state and swapped that funny face for a camping stove. Got it? The rhythm. Paperclip, pen, stove. Friends were shaking their heads. Parents were asking when he would find a real job. But Kyle was caught up in the excitement. He felt the world around him was a giant warehouse of things that were useless to some but treasures to others. He exchanged the stove for an old generator, the generator for an empty beer keg and a neon sign. Frankly, a questionable deal, but Kyle needed to keep moving. The keg got him a snowmobile, and that's where the real excitement began. Newspapers started writing stories about him. Imagine, a guy from the internet turned a paperclip into a snowmobile in just a few months. It was like magic. But Kyle didn't stop there. He traded the snowmobile for a 2-person vacation to a Canadian town called Yak. The vacation got him an old van. The van fetched him a recording contract. Do you know what he did with the contract? He gave it to a budding singer in exchange for a year of free living in a house in Phoenix. It seemed like a great solution for housing, but it was only a rental, and Kyle wanted ownership, so he took a risk. He traded the rental right for one evening in the company of rock star Alice Cooper. One evening, a couple of hours of conversation, people were yelling, "Kyle, you idiot! You traded a roof over your head for an autograph." But he knew what he was doing. He exchanged an evening with Alice Cooper for a snow globe that said "Kiss" on it. Yes, that very souvenir toy that you shake and it snows inside. It seemed like a total failure, the collapse of the whole idea. But then, a Hollywood actor named Corbin Burnson got involved. It turned out he was a fanatic collector of snow globes. He had thousands of them, but he didn't have that one. He offered Kyle a trade, the snow globe, in exchange for a role in his new movie, complete with payment, a contract, and all the works. And now for the final touch. The small town of Kipling in Saskatchewan decided they needed some fame. The town council offered Kyle a deal. They would give him a real 2-story house with a yard, fully renovated and in his name, in exchange for that role in the movie, so they could hold auditions among the residents of their town. Kyle agreed. After 1 year and 14 deals, he stood at the threshold of his own home. In his pocket there was no longer a red paperclip, but he did have keys. And you know what's the coolest part about this? He proved that the value of a thing is not what is written on the price tag at the store. It's about how much soul and adventure you are willing to put into it. The world is full of opportunities if you are ready to start with something tiny. So, Have you looked at your desk with fresh eyes? Sometimes, one small detail can build a whole destiny. Speaking of details, we have a story in our archive about a man who decided that if he were going to build something great, it should be visible even from space. And no, it's not the Great Wall of China. Story number 7. A concrete sea in the hotel garden, or how one man gifted his country itself. Listen, have you ever felt such deep gratitude that you wanted to, I don't know, move mountains, or at least build one small one out of concrete right in your garden? You see, we often say thank you, but the hero of this story decided that words were too cheap. He decided to gift Scotland a miniature of Scotland at a scale of 1 to 10,000. Let's travel back to the 70s of the last century, Peeblesshire County. On the green lawn behind the old Boron Castle Hotel stands an elderly man with a stern face. His name is Jan Tomaszek. He is a Polish veteran. During World War II, he found himself here in Scotland when his country was engulfed in flames. The Scots welcomed him, warmed him, gave him a home. And now, 30 years later, having become a successful tailor, Jan decided it was time to pay his debts. Imagine this crazy project. This is not just a papier-mâché model at a school exhibit. This is a gigantic three-dimensional map of the country. 50 meters in length, 40 meters in width, the largest in the world. I hired a group of cartography students from Krakow. They came for the summer, armed with theodolites, blueprints, and immense patience. Imagine that rhythm. Day after day, they laid out the contours of the coastline. Concrete, tons of concrete. They built every mountain, every valley. Ben Nevis, the highest point in Scotland, was the size of a large dog here. And this is where the coolest detail begins. Jan wanted the map to be alive. He laid a complex system of pipes throughout the area. When he opened a valve, water from a local stream started to flow around the map. Real water. It filled the hollows, mimicking the tides. Loch Ness filled with moisture. All the rivers began to flow. It was Scotland in miniature, surrounded by a real ocean that you could walk through in rubber boots. You know what's the most touching part? Jan did this not for tourists. He did it so his fellow countrymen, Polish soldiers who once patrolled these shores, could come here and see the entire country at once, in one glance, like gods. But hold on, years went by, Jan passed away, the hotel changed owners, and the map. Well, you understand, nature doesn't like concrete. The bushes began to sprout through the mountains, ice shattered the valleys. The great Polish map of Scotland turned into ruins, hidden under a layer of turf and moss. She was forgotten for decades. People walked over her, completely unaware that beneath their feet lay a lost world. It wasn't until the early 2000s that a group of enthusiasts accidentally stumbled upon strange concrete protrusions in the forest. They began to dig. At first, the tip of a mountain appeared, then the outline of the Isle of Skye. It resembled an archaeological excavation of Atlantis, only located in the Scottish wilderness. Today, this map is a monument. It has been restored. It stands majestic once more. And when you stand at the edge of this concrete sea, you feel something special. That one person, armed with concrete and a love for foreign land, can leave a mark that not even time can erase. Impressive, isn't it? Sometimes it feels like gratitude is something fleeting, and then you find a 50-meter monument hidden in the bushes. Speaking of things hidden from sight, our archives contain a story of how one small miscalculation turned an ordinary subway trip into an unexpected journey. No, it's not about missing your stop. Story number 8. The Golden God Beneath a Layer of Cheap Plaster. Have you ever found something truly valuable? Not a 10-ruble note in an old jacket, but something that changes your perception of the world. Picture it. The year is 1955, Bangkok. The heat and humidity are so intense that clothing clings to your body in an instant. In one of the old abandoned monasteries stands a colossal statue of Buddha. Honestly, it looks rather pathetic, a chunk of gray plaster, dusty, unattractive, bulky. There's no aesthetic appeal. The monks decided to move it to another temple. You know, just your typical bureaucratic task. They called a crane. The workers grumbled because the massive statue weighed several tons. They wrapped it in cables and began to lift it. And then there was a pause. Silence. The cables snapped. Imagine that sound, a heavy, dull thud. The statue fell into the mud. The monks were horrified. The workers froze. The plaster began to crack. It was pouring rain, and one monk, distressed by what had happened, went to inspect the damage. He took a flashlight, shone it into one of the crevices, and froze. Inside the gray concrete, something gleamed, bright, luminous. You know that shine you can't mistake for anything else? He began carefully chiseling off pieces of plaster. First, a shoulder appeared, then a face. After several hours of work, there stood before them a Buddha made of pure gold, 5.5 tons of pure 18-karat gold, the largest golden statue in the world. It turned out that 300 years ago, when the country was facing invasion, the locals decided to protect their sacred object. Instead of hiding it in the ground, they devised something genius. They covered it with a thick layer of plaster and broken glass, made it ugly, made it useless. And it worked. The invaders passed by, not even glancing at this piece of junk. And then, those who knew the secret simply couldn't pass it down. Time passed, generations changed. Everyone got used to it being just an old plaster statue. She stood under the rain and sunlight for hundreds of years, holding within her treasures worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you know what's the coolest part about this? It's a metaphor for our lives. Sometimes, behind the most unremarkable plaster outer layer, something incredibly valuable is hidden. Sometimes we need a rope to snap, so we can see what's inside. So, have you peeked inside yourself? Often, the greatest discoveries await us in the places we least expect to find them. By the way, speaking of things that change form, in our archives, there is a story about a man who decided that if he was going to change the world, he would do it using the most ordinary sound, but not the kind we hear with our ears. Story number 9. The car that forgot it needed a driver. Listen, do you believe in magic? No, not the kind with rabbits and hats and marked cards. I'm talking about the real magic of technology that makes people on the streets rub their eyes and cross themselves. Imagine this. 1925. New York, Broadway, noon. The city is bustling. Yellow taxis, the clatter of streetcars, thousands of people in bowler hats and long dresses. And suddenly, the crowd freezes. In the midst of the busy traffic, a luxurious Chandler sedan rolls slowly. Beautiful, shiny, enormous. But there's one tiny detail, a minuscule one. There's no driver. I mean, the seat is completely empty. The steering wheel is turning by itself. The car smoothly swerves around a distracted pedestrian, slows down at an intersection, and honks its horn, beep beep. Imagine the horror and excitement of those people. 1925. To them, this looked like a polite ghost had possessed the car. But wait, it was much more interesting. Following behind at a distance of several dozen meters was another car. Inside was a man named Francis Scudina. No, not the great illusionist Houdini, although the last name is amusingly similar. Francis was a radio engineer. In his hands was a strange device with buttons and levers. This was the first radio-controlled driverless car operation in history. Listen, it sounds simple now with our Wi-Fi and satellites, but back then, the trunk of the Chandler was packed with gigantic tubes, coils, and wires. Radio waves sent signals to tiny electric motors that pulled the brake levers, turned the steering wheel, and pressed down on the gas. Francis navigated his American Wonder car across all of Manhattan. Thousands of people ran after it. Police officers, bewildered, whistled into their whistles. The car traveled down Fifth Avenue, carefully weaving through the flow of vehicles. It was a triumph. People shouted that the future had arrived, that soon no one would even need to steer anymore. But of course, there were some hiccups. At one point, radio interference, you know how that goes, got in the way. The car suddenly decided it was time to turn the wrong way. It nearly crashed into a shop window, but Francis managed to regain control just in time. Fortunately, no one was hurt, except for a couple of frightened horses that looked like they thought the world was ending. Do you know what's the funniest part? After this incredible journey, Francis proposed his invention to the military and postal services. And what did they say? Too complicated, too expensive. And why do we need a driverless car when we have so many unemployed drivers? The project was shut down, and the idea was forgotten for a decade. Now, almost 100 years later, we are building drones again, thinking that we are pioneers. But it all started with one brilliant sedan on Broadway that simply wanted to prove that invisible waves could be stronger than human hands. So, do you feel the breath of the future from the past? Sometimes we think we are at the peak of progress, but it turns out we are just catching up with ideas from those who lived a century earlier. By the way, speaking of things that seem impossible until you do them, there is a story about how one man decided that he could trick not only sight, but time itself. Story number 10. A guiding thread made of paper and gears. Have you ever tried to navigate a strange city using a paper map? You know, the huge one that you can't fold back along the old creases and that forever obstructs your view of the windshield? Now imagine you are driving a car. The speed is decent, hands on the wheel, and you need to know when to turn. Today we just point at our smartphone screens and listen to a pleasant voice saying,
"In 200 meters, turn right."
but picture this. Wait, hold on. Imagine it's 1932. No satellites, no internet. Even radios in cars were a luxury for the select few. And here, on the dusty roads of Italy, rolls a strange automobile. Inside, on the dashboard, there's a device secured that looks like a tiny television from the future, only much smaller. This is the Auto, the world's first device that we would call a navigator today. Honestly, when I first heard about this, I thought it was a joke. A navigator in the 30s? But the engineers of that time were incredibly inventive. Look at this device. Inside, there are two rollers. A long, narrow strip of paper is stretched between them. There's a map drawn on the strip. And here's where it gets interesting. How to make the map move in sync with the car. It's genius in its simplicity. The device was connected with a cable directly to the speedometer. Do you understand? You hit the gas, the wheels spin faster, the speedometer registers the speed, and the cable transfers the rotation to the rollers in the device, and the map begins to crawl. This was the real hype of that time. You drive, and the map in front of your eyes moves at the exact same speed as you roll down the road. You always know where you are. Well, almost always. By the way, this system had one tiny problem. If you decided to veer off the main route, say if you wanted to stop at a cozy cafe in a neighboring village, the navigator became useless. The map was linear, just one straight road. To continue your journey, you needed to pull out a new roll of paper with the correct route, remove the old one, and load in the new one. That was quite an adventure. Fingers stained with ink, the ribbon tangling. Passing cyclists look at you as if you're crazy. But do you know what's really cool about this? The rhythm of progress. Back then, people understood that one must know where they are going. They didn't wait for someone to launch rockets into space. They took paper, glue, a couple of gears, and created the future with their own hands. The automotive iteration didn't become mainstream. It was too expensive, too complicated to prepare those paper rolls for every road in the world. The idea slipped into a slumber, hiding for a decade, and only at the end of the 20th century did it return to us in the form of pixels on a screen. But every time your navigator recalculates the route, remember, somewhere back in the 30s, a paper roll from a small Italian device was spinning invisibly. So, did you feel how the gears of history turn our present days? Sometimes it's helpful to look back, to understand how far we've traveled. Speaking of journeys, we have a story in our archives about how one very persistent woman decided that the best way to see the world wasn't by car or train, but, well, let's say something completely unintended for that purpose. Story number 11. The modesty that taught us to listen to our hearts through a paper tube. So, have you ever felt truly awkward? You know, when your cheeks burn, words get tangled, and you just want to, well, evaporate. become part of the decor. We usually try to forget such moments quickly, but imagine, one doctor from Paris in 1816 transformed his shyness into something that each of us has seen at least once in our lives. Let's transport ourselves to gloomy Paris, to the Necker Hospital. A man named René Laennec walks through the corridors. He is an outstanding doctor, smart, meticulous, but, honestly, extremely shy, just pathological about it. Back then, to listen to a patient's heartbeat, a doctor had to press their ear directly to the patient's chest. You understand, no intermediary devices, just the doctor, the patient, and a very, very intimate distance. This was called direct auscultation. And then René is invited to examine a young woman. She has obvious heart problems. She is a lady of high society, wearing an elaborate dress and corset, all the trimmings. And at that moment, René froze. He looks at her. She looks at him. He realizes pressing his ear to the chest of this noble woman is simply, well, beyond his decorum. Impossible. The suspense in the room was so thick you could scoop it with a spoon. Doctors, colleagues are watching, relatives are waiting, and René is blushing, not knowing what to do. And then, there is a pause. He remembers a simple thing. You've seen how children play in the yard. One presses their ear to a long log, while another scrapes the other end. The sound amplifies. It's physics. René grabs a stack of paper lying on the table, a few sheets. He rolls them into a tight, firm tube and ties it with some ribbon. Everyone's looking at him like he's lost his mind. He places one end of this paper contraption to the chest of the patient, and the other to his ear. And lo and behold, he didn't just hear the heart, he heard it as clearly as never before. Every valve, every beat. The sound was crystal clear. The paper tube acted as a perfect amplifier. On that day, René not only saved his reputation as a modest man, but also changed medicine forever. You see, he was so inspired that he came home and began experimenting. He crafted tubes from ivory wood. He named his device a stethoscope, which translates from Greek to chest examiner, although, to be honest, he did not examine it, he listened. But the name caught on. His colleagues initially laughed, saying, "René, why do you need this pipe? We have ears." But when they realized that through this pipe they could hear disease at an early stage, the laughter stopped. Do you know what is most touching? René Laennec considered this invention his greatest pride for the rest of his life. Not scientific treatises nor titles, but this ability to listen to life without disturbing another person's peace. Well, remembering that cold metal disc at the doctor's office? Now you know it came from simple human shyness and a folded piece of paper. Sometimes our weaknesses are exactly what the world needs for a great breakthrough. By the way, speaking of breakthroughs and people who see the world differently, there is a story about how an ordinary postal clerk decided if he was going to send letters, they should reach their destination, even if the recipient was, let's say, nowhere near where they were expected to be. Story number 12. The bed that saved a gentleman's reputation. So, have you ever lived in a truly tiny apartment? You know, one where the bed takes up 90% of the space? If guests come over, they have to either sit on your blanket or stand in the doorway. We call this a studio today and pay a fortune for it. But imagine the year 1890. San Francisco, a city of fog, steep hills, and very strict rules of decorum. In one of those little rooms lived a young man named William Lawrence Murphy. The guy was ambitious, but not wealthy. His housing was, let's say, ascetic. One room that served as a living room, dining room, and bedroom. And here comes the main intrigue. You see, back then, the code of honor and rules of etiquette were stricter than any criminal code. There was one ironclad rule. A gentleman could never, under any circumstances, invite a lady into his bedroom. This was considered the height of indecency. A scandal would disgrace the entire town. But if you have only one room, and in the center of it sits a huge, undeniable bed, then your entire dwelling automatically is considered a bedroom. Do you understand the drama? And William was in love, and not with just anyone, but with a young opera singer. He desperately wanted to invite her for tea, to discuss music, and generally to show hospitality. But the bed, the cursed mountain of mattresses and pillows, stood between him and his happiness like an insurmountable wall. And here, wait, William did not give up. He was not just a romantic, he was the son of a mechanic. He started to think. If I cannot physically remove the bed from the room, I must make it disappear visually. I need a trick. Magic. But without mirrors and rabbits, just loops, springs, and the good old wardrobe. Imagine this process. For nights on end, William was carving something, fitting gears, and cursing the stubborn wood. He developed a unique hinge mechanism. The idea was that the bed, along with all the mattresses, could be lifted vertically with a simple motion and hidden in the wall cabinet. 1, and you have a bedroom. 2, and voila, you have an exquisite living room with no hint of nighttime rest. Listen, when he first invited his singer, he was as nervous as if he were committing a crime. She walked in. The room was empty and spacious. They drank tea and discussed opera. William's reputation was perfectly safe. The bed quietly sat in the wardrobe like a well-behaved dog. Soon, William realized that his invention was needed not just by lovesick poor people. Cities were growing, apartments were getting smaller. In 1909, he patented his wardrobe bed. You know what's the most amusing part? This invention became a symbol of an entire era. Murphy beds began to be installed in hotels, on ships, and in urban high-rises. William became fabulously wealthy. He married that very opera singer. Yes, indeed, the trick with the wardrobe worked 100%, but there was one side effect. In those days, mechanisms were, well, let's say, temperamental. In silent comedies of the early 20th century, the Murphy bed became the main comedic character. It would fold up at the most inopportune moments, swallowing the main characters along with their shoes. People laughed in theaters, watching how a person struggled with their own furniture. But despite all the jokes, William's bed has stood the test of time. It is still with us today. And every time you see a bed that hides into the wall, remember that it is not just there for saving space, it is there for love. And one very persistent guy from San Francisco who just wanted to have tea with an opera singer while keeping things proper. Well, do you feel how sometimes everyday difficulties push us toward great deeds? Sometimes just one closed wardrobe door is enough to open the door to a new life. By the way, speaking of things that change their appearance, in our archives we have a story about how an ordinary piece of fabric, created for rough work, became the main symbol of freedom, making its way from mines to global runways. And no, it's not what you first thought. Story number 13. A little frozen cup that changed summer forever. Listen, have you ever left something important outside, just forgotten it by accident? We usually scold ourselves for such forgetfulness. Keys in the lock, wallet on a bench, these always bring stress. But imagine, one 11-year-old boy from Oakland forgot a cup of soda on the porch, and his mistake ultimately cost millions. Millions. And he just wanted a drink. Let's transport ourselves to 1905, California. But honestly, it wasn't that typically hot on that night. A rare chill settled over the city. You know, that biting cold that makes steam escape from your mouth? Little Frank Epperson was busy on the porch. He was trying to make himself a fizzy drink. You know how it is with kids. Powder, water, a stick for stirring. He mixed everything in a regular glass, took a couple of sips, and got distracted. Maybe his mom called him, or he saw something interesting in the garden. In any case, the glass was left on the railing with the wooden stick inside. The night was long, cold, and quiet. The next morning, Frank ran outside. He remembered his drink, but instead of liquid, he saw ice. The drink had frozen right around the stick. Frank, like any normal child, didn't think for long. He pulled on the stick and voila! An icy cylinder popped out of the glass, bright and sweet. And it was incredibly easy to hold. Listen, that was a moment of enlightenment. Frank licked it and realized it was genius. He started making these things for his friends, then for the whole neighborhood. But you know how it is in childhood. Chores, games, school. The story of the ice on a stick kind of faded into the background. 18 years went by. 18. Frank grew up and became a grown man. And in the year 1923, he decided it was time to act. He remembered that frosty evening in Oakland. Frank patented his invention under the name Epsicle, derived from his last name and the word icicle. But then his kids intervened. They constantly asked, "Dad, make your popsicle." Well, Dad's popsicle. In English, that sounded like popsicle. Frank listened and renamed the product to Popsicle. Do you know that name? The whole world knows it. It's a classic. That very fruity ice we all love in July. By the way, when Frank first presented it at the Fireman's Ball, people were just astonished. They had never seen food you could hold by a stick without getting your hands dirty. It was a sensation, pure delight. In the first year, he sold thousands of them. You know what's most ironic? Frank Epperson eventually sold the brand rights to a large company because he simply needed the money. But his name will forever remain in history as the name of the man who turned a child's oversight into the main symbol of summer happiness. So, are you craving something cold? Sometimes all it takes is one frosty morning and a forgotten glass to create a legend. Speaking of things that start small, in our archives, there's a story about how one man decided he could build an entire empire using only what others tossed in the trash. And it was not just a business, it was true transformation magic. Story number 14, the coffee pot that became the world's first movie star. So listen, what are you willing to do for a cup of coffee? When the deadline is looming, your eyes are drooping, and your brain refuses to come up with even the simplest idea, we usually just get up and go to the kitchen. But imagine if your kitchen is on another floor, at the other end of the building. And when you finally make it there, after navigating a bunch of stairs and hallways, the coffee pot is empty. Silence. Just a drop trickling down the glass. It's a tragedy, right? Pure disappointment. Let's move back to 1991. England, the University of Cambridge, the computer laboratory. At that time, there were people working there who were literally creating our digital future. But even geniuses need coffee. In the lab, there was a single coffee pot for everyone. It was located in a room called the lounge, while the staff worked on different floors. Imagine this routine. A person stands up, walks through the entire building, climbs the stairs, opens the door, and finds it empty. This happened up to 10 times a day. Dozens of frustrated scientists, hundreds of wasted minutes. But these were programmers. They didn't start hanging schedules or complaining in chats, which were nearly non-existent back then. They elegantly solved the problem in true engineering fashion. One of the staff members dragged an old video camera from home. Another guy, Paul Jardetsky, wrote a program. They aimed the camera at the coffee pot. The camera took one picture every second, black and white, grainy, far from Hollywood quality. But now each lab employee could open a small window on their computer, and voila, in real time, they could see whether the coffee pot was full or empty. This was the world's first webcam, even though the term webcam didn't exist yet. Now listen, the strangest part comes next. 2 years passed, the first internet browsers emerged, and the scientists thought, why not stream the footage online, just for fun, to show colleagues from other countries what British IT workers live like? The coffee pot from Cambridge instantly became a global celebrity. Imagine, people from Japan, America, and Australia visited the site just to look at a glass vessel filled with brown liquid at an English university. 1 million people, tens of millions of views. The coffee pot was featured in news reports and written about in newspapers. It became a symbol of how the internet connects the world. People wrote letters saying, "Oh, today the coffee looks stronger," or, "Hey, someone, fill it up already." The stream continued for 10 years. 10. In 2001, they decided to ceremoniously disconnect the coffee pot. The laboratory was moving to a different building. This event was covered by all major global media outlets. The last cup of coffee was consumed live, to applause from viewers all around the globe. You know what's the funniest part? The legendary coffee pot was later put up for auction and sold for £3,350 sterling. It was purchased by a German magazine to be displayed in their office, and, of course, to launch a new stream. Thus, an ordinary deer and the unwillingness to walk up the stairs in vain led to the creation of a technology that we today can't imagine our lives without. Every time you make a video call, remember, it all started with a boring coffee pot in Cambridge. So, have you brewed yourself a cup? Sometimes, the greatest things come from simply wanting to save a couple of steps. By the way, speaking of things that start with curiosity, we have a story in our archive about how one little girl found treasure that was older than history itself. And she didn't even realize she was holding the key to the past. Story number 15. A girl who saw the ceiling of the world. Listen, have you ever noticed that adults always look down at their feet or straight ahead? We are constantly worried about not tripping, finding the right path, or simply avoiding a pole. We search for answers on the ground. But children look everywhere. They don't have our filters of what is important and what isn't. Imagine that one such walk of a little girl changed forever what we think about humanity. Everything. Let's move to the year 1879, Spain, in the province of Cantabria. It was summer outside, but in the mountains, there was always a chill in the air. There lived a gentleman named Marcelino Sanz de Satuola. He was not a professional scientist. He was, how should I put it, an enthusiastic amateur. A lawyer by profession, but deep down, he was an antiquities hunter. He loved digging in the earth, searching for old bones or arrowheads. That day, he went to the Altamira cave, a regular hole in the mountains that shepherds had discovered a few years earlier. Marcelino took his 8-year-old daughter Maria with him. You know, a family outing. Dad digging in the dirt, daughter running around. Picture this scene. The cave was dark, damp, smelling of stone and antiquity. Marcelino lit a dim oil lamp. He knelt at the entrance to one of the chambers and began passionately sifting through the earth. He was looking for traces of ancient humans, shards of pottery, deer teeth, and all sorts of small things. His gaze was fixed on the ground. He was convinced that everything important was in the dust. Meanwhile, little Maria was bored watching her dad dig. She took a candle and wandered deeper into the chamber. The ceiling was low. An adult would have to bend down, but for an 8-year-old girl, it was just right. She looked up. The candlelight flickered, revealing uneven rock formations from the darkness. And then, silence. Just a drop of water falling somewhere in the depths. "Daddy!" she called out. "Look, bulls!" At first, Marcelino didn't even turn around. What bulls in a cave? My daughter is imagining things. But Maria was persistent. She tugged at his sleeve. Reluctantly, Marcelino stood up, took a few steps, bent down low and raised his lamp to the ceiling, and froze. His heart probably skipped a beat. Above them, across the entire vault of the cave, were painted bison. Huge, powerful. They were drawn in ochre, charcoal, and something else that gave an incredible red color. The ancient artist brilliantly utilized the irregularities of the stone. The bulge of the rock became the fierce side of the beast. The crack took the shape of a back arch. They looked alive. In the flickering light of the lamp, it seemed as if they were breathing. It was astonishing. Marcelino realized this was not just art. This was art at the highest level. But when he published his findings, the world responded with a cold shower. The scientists of that time simply laughed in his face. They said, "Listen, Marcelino, do you take us for fools? Ancient people were savages. They could only beat each other with clubs. They could not create such beauty. You must have hired an artist to paint it all and make you famous." He was accused of forgery. The greatest minds of that century called him a liar. Marcelino died without ever receiving recognition. You see, a person found a treasure, and for that he was trampled on. It was only 20 years later, when similar drawings were discovered in other caves in France and Spain, that the world gasped. It turned out that Maria was right. This bison was over 14,000 years old. 14,000! It turned out that our ancestors were not just cave dwellers, They were artists, dreamers, creators. Maria grew up and witnessed her father's triumph. She lived to see the day when the Altamira cave was called the Sistine Chapel of prehistory. Do you know what's most important about this? If on that day Marcelino had gone to the cave alone, he would likely have sat there all day, staring at the ground. It wouldn't have occurred to him to raise the lamp above his head. Sometimes we all need a little girl to tug at our sleeve and say, "Hey, look up, there's a whole world up there." So, when was the last time you looked at the clouds or the stars? Sometimes the truth is not found where we usually search for it. By the way, speaking of things that are hidden right under our noses, in our archive, there's a story about how a very strange find in an ordinary field led to the discovery of a city once thought to be a legend. And this was not just any city. It was a true engineering masterpiece hidden beneath the roots of grass. This is story number 16. The village that taught the world to think 3 steps ahead. Listen, have you ever felt that your city has its own, let's say, genetic code? A unique hobby that unites everyone, from infants to the elderly. We usually take pride in our local football teams or a special type of pie. But imagine a place where your social status, your education, and even your right to marry once depended on how well you moved wooden figures on a board. Let's travel to Germany. The Harz foothills, a village called Strübeck. At first glance, it seems like a typical European settlement. Neat houses, geraniums in the windows, spires of churches. But if you take a closer look at the details, you'll find yourself dizzy. The chessboard pattern is everywhere, on building facades, on the town's coat of arms, even in the shape of bushes in public gardens. And it all started, well, hold on. The story says it all began in the year 2011. 11 centuries ago, back in those distant times, an important guest, Count Gundeling, was brought to the local tower, proudly named the Tower of the Imprisoned. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was a sticking point in grand politics. And to keep from going mad with boredom within those 4 walls, he started playing chess. But with whom? With the guards, simple village men who had previously known only plow and shovel, suddenly discovered that the world was made up of 64 squares. The Count turned out to be an excellent teacher. The guards went home and taught their children, and those taught their friends. You see, it was like an intellectual virus that swept through the whole village. 100 years later, there was not a single person left in Strübeck who didn't know how a knight moved or what castling was. But do you know what's most astonishing about this? Rhythm of their lives. In 1823, imagine, almost 200 years ago, chess was officially introduced into the school curriculum, alongside subjects like mathematics or penmanship. Every child in the town was required to pass an exam on endgames to receive their diploma. By the way, they had one incredible tradition. When a young man wanted to marry a local girl, he had to play a game of chess against her father, or even the mayor of the town. And if the guy lost, let's just say, the wedding could be postponed. It was a kind of test of intelligence. Were you worthy to join our family of thinkers? By the end of the 19th century, when great grandmasters of the time came to the town, they were shocked. They would enter an ordinary tavern, sit down at a table with a simple farmer in a worn-out jacket, and lose. Because for that farmer, chess was not a sport, but a breath of life, part of his everyday existence. You know what's the kindest part of this? This tradition is still alive today. Every year, there are tournaments where children play living chess, dressing up in costumes of kings and pawns. It's not just about dry logic. It's about the connection between generations, about how one small game, originating in a tiny chamber, can turn an ordinary village into the smartest corner of the planet. So, do you feel like dusting off the old board? Sometimes the quietest passions create the loudest fame. Speaking of things that require ironclad logic and incredible patience, we have a story in our archive about a man who decided he could deceive everyone using only silence. And he was not a magician, but a real spy, whose main weapon was ordinary ink. Story number 17. A revolution born in a prison cell. Listen, have you ever thought, looking at your bathroom shelf, that the most ordinary item, the one that starts every one of your mornings, has quite a specific origin? We are accustomed to bright plastic handles, nylon bristles, and dentists' promises of a dazzling smile. But imagine a time when hygiene was, shall we say, a matter of chance, and when cleanliness came not from a laboratory, but from a cramped cell in London's prison. Let's move back to 1780, London, Newgate Prison. To be honest, a rather unpleasant place. Cold stones, dampness, and a lot of free time for those locked inside. Among the prisoners was a man named William Addis. He ended up there for, well, let's say his involvement in riots. It was a common occurrence back then. And just imagine his daily life. Morning. William wakes up. He wants to feel like a human being, but reality smells nothing like violets. In those years, people cleaned their teeth, if they even did, with a piece of cloth dipped in salt or soot. You know what I mean, rubbing dirt on your teeth, hoping it would help. William thought that was wrong, dirty, and ineffective. He looked at that cloth and thought, there must be a better way. There has to be. And then, a pause. Silence in the prison yard. During lunch, William saved a small bone. It seemed to be a shank from his meager meat diet. He traded a bit of bristle with the guard. Wait a minute, it was actually a bit different. They say he just gathered bundles of coarse hairs that were left on the floor after some hides were dragged by. He began to act. He didn't have any tools, just patience and a scrap of metal. He drilled small holes into the bone. You know, it was fine craftsmanship for someone sitting in dim light. He pushed the bundles of bristles into these tiny holes and secured them with glue, which, honestly, in prison, you can find the strangest things if you know who to bargain with. When he finished, he held in his hands the first prototype of a modern toothbrush in history. A bone handle, natural bristles, compact and comfortable. The other inmates probably looked at him like he was crazy. "William, what are you doing with that bone?" But when he was released, he didn't throw away his creation. On the contrary, he realized he had stumbled upon a gold mine. Addis opened a small workshop. People were skeptical at first. Well, you see, old habits die hard. But gradually, one gentleman tried it, then another, and it took off. Addis's brush became a symbol of a new era. It was effective. It simply worked. William Addis became extraordinarily wealthy. His company, which he named Wisdom to Brushes, still exists today. Can you imagine? 300 years of history started with a gnawed bone in a prison cell. You know what's the most inspiring part? William didn't complain about his fate. He didn't give up in prison. He simply decided that even in the darkest place, you can come up with something that will make the world just a little cleaner. Literally. So, take a look at your toothbrush tonight with new respect. Sometimes, the most important things in our lives are born where we least expect to find them. Speaking of things that invisibly change our lives, we have a story in our archives about how a small piece of paper with nothing written on it helped save thousands of people, just passing from hand to hand in complete silence. Story number 18. The Queen of the Roads Who Traded a Corset for a Wrench. Listen, have you ever set out on a journey knowing full well that the roads, well, simply don't exist? No, I'm not talking about the potholes in the yard that we complain about every spring. I'm talking about thousands of miles of mud, sand, and uncertainty. Today, we can't even get to the nearby shopping mall without a navigator gently warning us about every bump. Now, imagine the year 1909, the United States of America. Back then, the automobile was considered, well, let's say, an expensive and very finicky toy for wealthy gentlemen. It was believed that women and complicated machinery were absolutely incompatible. The maximum a lady was allowed to do was sit in the passenger seat and hold an umbrella gracefully. But then, Alice Ramsey stepped onto the scene. She was 22 years old. She loved speed, and she was damn tired of being told, "You can't." Imagine that challenge. Alice decides to travel across the entire country, from New York to San Francisco, 3,800 miles. And that's where the real adventure begins. Do you know how many miles of paved road there were in the United States back then? 152. Everything else was just a path, from wagons, horse manure, swamps where cars could sink up to their headlights. Listen, she didn't go alone. She took 3 friends with her, but none of them could drive at all. Alice was the only mechanic, driver, and navigator in this all-girls crew. They didn't have maps. Well, maps as we understand them didn't exist. Do you know how they navigated? They had a guidebook that said things like, "Drive past the red barn, turn left at the fallen oak, and if you see the yellow fence, you've passed the turn." So off they went, in a dark green, open-top Max automobile, without a windshield or roof. The rhythm of their journey was absolutely crazy. Rain turned the ground into a sticky mess. Alice spent hours digging in the mud, putting boards under the tires. She changed the tires herself, and they had to change them 11 times. She cleaned the spark plugs while standing knee-deep in water. Once, the brake pedal broke, and Alice simply tied a rope to the lever and pulled it whenever she needed to stop. Pure engineering ingenuity. By the way, when they passed through small towns in the Midwest, people ran out into the streets. They had never seen a monster car, let alone 4 women inside. Local newspapers wrote, "This is madness. They will perish in the plains." But Alice just adjusted her glasses and pressed the gas. One night, they had to sleep in a field because the car got stuck in a deep ditch. Another time, they encountered a gang of riders, but they turned out to be just curious cowboys wanting to see how the engine worked. After 59 days, they arrived in San Francisco, dirty, exhausted, but absolutely happy. Alice became the first woman in history to cross the continent behind the wheel. She proved, it's not about the terrain or the strength of your arms, it's about character. You know what's the coolest part? Alice Ramsey drove until she was 94 years old. 94! She lived through the era of horse-drawn carriages and saw people fly to the moon. But for her, the most important thing always remained that journey through the mud and fog, when there was nothing ahead but the horizon. So, do you feel the taste of road dust on your lips? Sometimes, to find yourself, you just need to travel as far away from home as possible, with no map in hand. Speaking of long journeys and incredible patience, we have a story in our archives about how one person decided that he could conquer time without moving from his spot. And his weapon was a simple brush that created a masterpiece where it was never supposed to be seen. Story number 19. The king who was too rich for this planet. Listen, have you ever wondered what true wealth is? Well, it's not the case when you can afford a new car or a holiday in the islands. I am talking about money so vast that its very existence could shatter the economy of an entire region for decades. Today, we follow the lists of the world's richest people. But to be honest, all these modern billionaires are like children compared to a man who lived 700 years ago. Let's transport ourselves to the year 1324. Africa, the Mali Empire. On the throne sits a man named Mansa Musa. You see, at that time, Europe was gasping from hunger, diseases, and endless wars. But in Mali, it was different. There was gold. An incredible, absurd amount of gold. It is said that half of the world's gold supply at that time was mined right there. And then, Mansa decided to make a pilgrimage, a journey from his city of Timbuktu to the holy city of Mecca. But this was not an ordinary trip. Imagine this spectacle. The intrigue begins right on the horizon. A caravan is moving across the scorching sands of the Sahara. 60,000 people. 60,000. This was not a caravan. It was an entire city that decided to stroll through the desert. 12,000 servants, dressed in the finest Persian silk, each holding a staff made of pure gold. 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold dust. The rhythm of this procession was majestic and intimidating. Listen, when this golden stream entered Cairo, people were simply aghast. Mansa Musa was not greedy at all. On the contrary, he was scattering gold left and right. He built mosques in every city where he stopped on Fridays. He handed out gold bars to the poor, merchants, and officials. He bought souvenirs at prices that seemed outrageous. And then there was a pause. Silence. Do you know what happened next? He distributed so much gold in Cairo, Medina, and Mecca that its value crashed, simply devalued. This was the first recorded inflation in history, caused by one person. The economy of Egypt was devastated for 10 years ahead. Imagine this. There was so much gold that you could not even buy a bag of grain for it. Wait, I almost forgot the most important detail. Mansa Musa was not just a rich man, he was an enlightener. He returned not only with experiences but also with the finest architects, poets, and scholars of the Islamic world. He transformed Timbuktu into the intellectual capital of Africa. They built universities and giant libraries there. His empire became a place where books were valued more than the very gold he scattered in the desert. Listen, when he returned home, he learned about the crisis he had caused in Cairo. And do you know what he did? He began repurchasing gold from local traders at inflated prices to stabilize the situation somehow. He was perhaps the only person in history who personally controlled the price of gold on an entire continent. Do you know what the most ironic thing is? On European maps of that time, Mansa Musa was depicted sitting on a throne, holding a giant golden orb. For Europe, he was a legend, a myth, almost a deity. But for his people, he was, above all, a man who proved that the true value of an empire is not the shiny metal in treasure chests, but the knowledge that resides in the minds of the people. So, have you felt the allure of those treasures? Sometimes it seems like money is everything, and then you realize that it can just as easily break the world. Speaking of things that hold tremendous value, yet are completely weightless, we have a story in our archive about a man who decided he could sell silence. And the most incredible part is that there were people willing to pay for it. This is story number 20, The Secret Treasure in the Roots of a Fallen Oak Tree. Listen, have you ever wondered what the most unassuming, yet almost detective-like item in your home is? No, I'm not talking about the TV remote that always goes missing. I'm talking about an ordinary pencil, that simple one. A wooden stick with a gray core. We chew on it when we think, or scrawl our shopping lists with it. But imagine a time when people were willing to go to servitude for a piece of that gray substance, and soldiers guarded it with loaded rifles. Let's travel to England, the year 1564, in the county of Cumbria, in the valley of Borrowdale. It's nighttime, and there's a terrifying storm. You know, that kind of weather when it seems like the sky is about to split in half. The wind uproots ancient oaks, while the rain turns roads into rivers. The next morning, a local shepherd, whose name history hasn't preserved, but let's call him Bill, went out to check on his flock and saw a fallen tree. A huge oak lay on its side, its black, wet roots exposed. Bill peered into the hole where the tree had been and saw something strange. Stones, but not ordinary ones. They were soft, greasy to the touch, and most astonishing of all, they stained his hands with a thick, shiny black color. The shepherd thought he discovered coal and tried to set it on fire. It wouldn't burn. Well, Bill thought, maybe it's medicine, though his sheep wouldn't eat it. So Bill took a piece of that black mud and marked one of his sheep, and lo and behold, the mark turned out clear, bright, and wouldn't wash away in the rain. Thus, the world learned about graphite. Listen, this was the only known deposit of pure solid graphite in the world. There was none other like it on the planet. At first, people used it to brand livestock, but then, no wait, the intrigue got much more intense. It turned out that this material was perfect for lubricating cannonballs. If you coat the mold with graphite, the ball comes out smooth and flies farther. Graphite instantly became the #1 strategic resource, the property of the crown. They called it black lead, even though there was no lead in it at all. They built mines in Borrowdale, but they guarded them as if they were extracting diamonds the size of fists. Soldiers patrolled the area day and night. To stop theft, the mines only operated for a few weeks each year. Then they flooded them with water so no one could sneak in and steal even a crumb of black gold. The black market thrived. Smugglers risked their lives to carry a piece of graphite in their coat lining. Its price in London markets was simply astronomical. And do you know how pencils came about? People started cutting graphite into thin sticks, but it made a terrible mess on their hands. Then they started wrapping him in ropes and leather, and then they figured out they could put him in wooden cases. Thus, the first writing instrument in history was born. By the way, for a long time, only England held the secret to making real pencils. The French and the Germans tried to create something similar by mixing graphite dust with glue and sulfur, but it resulted in a useless product. The pencils scratched the paper and broke easily. English monopolism lasted for decades. Do you know what's the most ironic? Today, we throw away a pencil when it becomes too short, not even suspecting that 400 years ago, for such a stub, one could buy a cow or land in jail. So, have you taken a new interest in your pencil holder? Sometimes the simplest things are the result of storms, fallen oaks, and strict state secrets. Speaking of secrets and things that literally change our world, we have in our archive a story about a man who decided he could defy gravity using only his imagination and a lot of silk. And no, he wasn't a magician. He was just someone who wanted to prove that the sky belongs to everyone. Story number 21. 6 dots that ignited light in eternal darkness. Have you ever tried reading in absolute darkness? Not in a way where there's at least some reflection from your phone screen, but in a way where the darkness around you is thick as jelly, where your eyes are just decorations that provide nothing. We are used to knowledge coming through light, through letters on paper or pixels on a monitor. But imagine a boy who decided that light could be, let's say, felt at his fingertips. And he did this at an age when others were just learning to write letters. Let's transport ourselves to 1812. France, a small town called Coupvray. In the cobbler's workshop, a 3-year-old boy named Louis is playing, Louis Braille. The air smells of leather, wax, and metal. Louis's father is momentarily distracted, just business as usual. A customer came in, or he needed to take out the trash. And Louis? He took a sharp tool from the table, a shoemaker's awl. Heavy, shiny, dangerous. He wanted to do what his father did, poke a piece of leather. And then there was a pause, silence interrupted by a single, sharp sound. His hand slipped and the awl went into his eye. You see, medicine at that time was, well, let's just say quite poor. An inflammation began. It spread to the other eye, and by the age of 5, little Louis was permanently blind. Imagine that world for a child. Just yesterday there were bright colors and sunlight, and today, just sounds and smells. But Louis didn't give up. He was an incredibly determined boy. He was sent to Paris, to a special school for blind children. And here's where it gets interesting. Do you know how they read there? It was some sort of engineering nightmare. They would press the paper from the other side to create huge raised letters. One book weighed as much as a bag of potatoes. To read a single page, one would have to run their hand over a huge surface for several minutes. It was slow, cumbersome, and incredibly inconvenient. Louis felt there had to be another way. Then, the captain of the French army, Charles Barbier, arrived at the school. He brought his invention, the night alphabet. Soldiers used it to read orders in the trenches at night without lighting a fire. It consisted of combinations of 12 dots punched into cardboard. Louis tried it out and realized it was a brilliant idea, but the execution was lacking. 12 dots were too many. A fingertip couldn't cover them all at once. You had to move your hand, which slowed down reading. At the age of 15, think about that, 15, Louis took that very same awl, the very tool that took away his sight, and began to carve out his path to light. He simplified the system, leaving just 6 dots, 3 high and 2 wide, an ideal rectangle that perfectly matched a fingertip. Each combination represented a letter, a number, or a note. Listen, when he showed this to his teachers, well, of course, they scoffed skeptically. What could a teenager come up with? At school, his system was even attempted to be banned. The principal believed blind children should read like normal people, not by some dots. But the children began to pass secret notes to each other under their desks. They understood. This is freedom. This is the chance to write for ourselves. Louis gave them not just reading, but writing. Louis Braille left this life far too young, at 43. He never realized that his system would become a world standard, that his name would be spoken in all the languages of the earth. Do you know what's the most touching? In his hometown of Coupvray, there is now a monument, and it says, "He opened the doors of knowledge to those who were locked in darkness." And when you see those little dots on elevator buttons or on medication packages today, remember, they are not just bumps. They are echoes of that little boy with an awl who decided that darkness was not a sentence, but just a problem to solve. So, do you feel how the tips of your fingers became a little more sensitive? Sometimes 6 dots are enough to change the fate of millions. By the way, speaking of things that change our world while remaining almost unnoticed, we have a story in our archive about a man who decided he could build the most reliable bridge in the world using only ordinary threads and a lot of patience. Story number 22. A city that wasn't on the map, but which everyone saw. Listen, do you enjoy films? Well, not the modern ones where everything is drawn on green screens with computers. I'm talking about that old Hollywood magic when sets were built from wood, paper mache, and faith in miracles when an entire world could fit in one studio. But imagine a situation where a set designer had to build not a room or a street, but an entire residential block suspended in the air, not for shooting an action film, but to hide a large factory from sight. Let's move to the year 1944, the American coast. Imagine factory BLD number D. It was a giant, a behemoth, 26 acres of concrete, steel, and glass. Inside, 30,000 people. The population of a small town was continuously monitored by airplanes, but there was one enormous problem. From a bird's-eye view, this factory shone in the sunlight like a giant target. It was too noticeable, too important. So the government decided, if we cannot move it, we must make it disappear. The illusion? Camouflage. But not just painted patches, but a true masterpiece of engineering. Enter John Stewart Detley, a Hollywood set designer, a man who knew how to deceive the eye. Listen, this was a brilliant adventure. Right on top of the factory, on a huge flat surface, they began to build a city, or rather, its imitation. It was called Wonderland. Imagine the rhythm of it. Workers erected hundreds of tiny houses, but they weren't real. Their height was only about 4 feet, up to an adult's waist. Wooden frames, walls made of plywood, but from 1,000 meters high, they looked like a cozy suburb. Detley had thought of everything. He paved streets with painted asphalt. He planted thousands of trees. Do you know what they were made of? Wire and painted burlap. The bushes were made from old feather stuffing. To make everything look alive, artists added details, painted shadows, tiny fences, even fake cars parked by the houses. The irony was that the workers at the factory continued their usual routine. Thousands of tons of steel moved beneath the feet of the residents of this toy town, while above on the roof, the wind blew, burlap rustled, and, honestly, it looked eerie and beautiful at the same time. Sometimes factory workers would go up to the roof during their lunch break. Imagine that scene. Adult men and women strolling through streets where the houses were at shoulder height and the trees could be stepped over. They felt like Gullivers in Lilliput. They walked across lawns that were actually nets stretched over ventilation shafts. But the magic worked. Pilots flying over the factory for training purposes reported, "Becht not detected, only a quiet residential area visible." You know what's the funniest part? After the war, this ghost town wasn't torn down right away. It remained there for several more years. Residents of the real town sometimes looked up and saw a strange, quiet fairy tale hovering over the industrial zone. Eventually, the plywood was taken apart, burlap was discarded. But this story remained as a monument to the time when Hollywood fantasy and stark calculation came together to create the largest set in human history. So, have you looked at the roofs of your houses with new eyes? Sometimes, what seems to us like solid ground is nothing more than thin plywood over an abyss of ideas. By the way, Speaking of things that change reality while remaining almost weightless, in our archives, there is a story about how one man decided he could stop an entire army using only sun catchers. And no, it was not a myth, but a genuine scientific calculation that made the sea burn. Story number 23. The island where time decided to turn back. Listen, have you ever felt like you're living too fast? When days blend into one gray blur, your phone is buzzing with notifications, and you barely notice the leaves unfolding on the trees. We're always rushing somewhere. But imagine a place where people have decided enough is enough, where time itself isn't a ruler measuring our productivity, but just, let's say, a suggestion. Let's travel to northern Norway, to a place called Samarøy. This little island is literally the edge of the earth. But it has a unique astronomical feature. From May 18th to July 26th, for 69 days, the sun never sets there, you understand? 0 hours of darkness. Midnight looks just like noon. Golden light floods the rocks, oceans, and fishermen's little houses. And here's where it gets interesting. The residents of the island, who have lived there for generations, realized one simple thing. If there's no night, then why do we need clocks? Imagine that rhythm of life. At 2 in the morning by normal time, you can find children playing soccer on the school field. At 3 in the morning, someone might start painting a fence or fixing a boat. Shops open when the owner wakes up. Neighbors drop by for coffee whenever they feel like it, without looking at the clock. Listen, that sounds like paradise for those who are always late. In 2019, the residents of Samarøy officially approached the government to request that time be abolished on their island altogether, making it the first time-free zone in the world. When you enter the island via a bridge, you don't just see a road sign. The entire bridge is adorned with clocks. People take off their wristwatches and leave them on the railings as a symbol that they no longer need them here. It looks like a modern artist's installation, but for the locals, it's a manifest of freedom. We want to reclaim our right to be human beings, not cogs in a machine, they say. If I want to fish at 4 in the morning, I will go fish. If I want to sleep until noon, I will sleep. Of course, skeptics and officials head in their hands. What about transportation schedules? What about schools? What about the mail? But the islanders just smile. They have proven that when you have no deadlines, stress levels drop to 0. People become kinder, they talk more with each other. Life becomes filled with meaning instead of numbers. Do you know what's the funniest part? This idea spread all over the world. Tourists began flocking to Samarøy just to forget what day of the week it is for a few days. Just to be. By the way, there's an unwritten rule on the island. If you ask a local what time it is, they will most likely look at the sun, shrug their shoulders and say, "It's time to live, my friend. Time to just live." So, are you tempted to throw your alarm clock out the window? Sometimes we need to travel to a little cold island to realize that we have created our own cages made of seconds and minutes. Speaking of people who know how to create their own worlds within reality, in our archive there is a story about a man who decided that he could build the castle of his dreams without using a single nail or a drop of cement, only relying on his own memory of a place that never existed. This is story number 24. The silk pouch that was not meant to get wet. Listen, have you ever noticed that we often make great discoveries simply because we, let's say, do not like to read instructions, or because we take what we see too literally? We are creatures of habit, but sometimes breaking a habit creates an entire industry. Imagine your morning: a cup, boiling water, and a small paper bag with a tag. It seems like it couldn't be simpler, but this bag came into existence only because one day in New York, a merchant decided to save money on tin cans. Let's travel to 1908, New York. The clattering of the first streetcars, the smell of coal, and the endless hustle of a port city. There lived a gentleman by the name of Thomas Sullivan. He sold tea. In those days, tea was a serious business. It was sold in large, heavy tin cans. It was expensive and cumbersome. If you wanted to send a customer just a sample to try a new variety, you would have to spend a fortune on packaging. Thomas sat in his shop, looked at the bills, and thought, there must be an easier way. Then, an idea struck him. He ordered hundreds of small bags made from the finest expensive Chinese silk. You know, that delicate translucent material. He filled them with spoonfuls of premium tea, tied them with a golden thread, and sent them to his best customers. Thomas's idea was that the buyers would open the bag, pour the leaves into the teapot, and, well, enjoy the aroma. The silk was merely an elegant packaging, nothing more. But wait, people are amazing creatures. Sullivan's customers received these bags. They looked at them. Beautiful? Yes. Convenient? Absolutely. And they thought, why should we open it? They simply took the silk cocoon and tossed it entirely into boiling water. Listen, this was a culinary revolution that even the creator could not have anticipated. Within a week, enthusiastic letters began pouring in about Thomas. Mr. Sullivan, this is genius. No more leaves stuck in our teeth, no more fussing with strainers, send us more. At first, Thomas didn't even understand what they were talking about. What leaves? What strainer? But when he realized that his customers were brewing expensive silk along with the tea, he didn't attempt to argue with them. He understood that he had just accidentally invented comfort. But you know what's most ironic about this? The very first tea bag was too perfect. The silk was too thick. It didn't let the flavor through well. Thomas started to experiment. He tried cheesecloth, but that imparted an off taste. He tried various types of fabric. Eventually, after years, another inventor came up with the idea of using special paper made from manila hemp fibers, the very material we use today. By the way, at first, true tea connoisseurs turned up their noses at this. They called it lazy man's tea. They said that the bag killed the soul of the drink, but the pace of life was quickening. People no longer wanted to wait 10 minutes for the brew to settle at the bottom. They wanted magic here and now. Today, thousands of such tea bags are brewed every second around the world. And every time you pull it by the string, remember that it all started with one frugal merchant who simply did not want to pay for extra tin cans. So, have you felt how sometimes mistakes in using things lead to progress? Sometimes it's enough not to open the packaging to open a new chapter in history. By the way, speaking of things that have immense power while remaining almost weightless, in our archive, there is a story about how one man decided that he could build the most reliable way to transmit information using only ordinary mirrors and sunlight. And this was not just a game. It saved lives at times when the ground was slipping away beneath people's feet. Story number 25. A labyrinth that no one wanted to leave without bread. Listen, do you enjoy grocery shopping? Honestly, for some, it's meditation. For others, it's a heavy burden. But imagine that process 100 years ago. 1916. You walk into a shop. There are no carts. There are no shelves from which you can take something yourself. Between you and the food stands a huge, often not very polite counter, and behind it, a clerk. You give him a list, and he slowly, oh so slowly, walks to the shelves, pulls out a bag of flour, weighs sugar, wraps cheese. If there are 3 or 4 people ahead of you, you might spend half your life in that line. It was long, it was expensive, and, to be honest, it was incredibly boring. But in Memphis lived a man named Clarence Saunders, and he decided that all of this was complete nonsense. Imagine the morning of September 11th, that very year. Clarence opens a store under the strange name of Piggly Wiggly. People approach the doors, peek inside, and freeze. There is no counter at all. Instead, there is a turnstile. You know, that rotating thing like at the subway, only made of wood. You pass through it and enter a real labyrinth. The shelves were arranged in such a way that you couldn't just grab a loaf of bread and run away. You had to pass by every single item, past cans, past spices, past fresh vegetables, and most importantly, you could touch all of it. For people of that time, it was shocking, a pure cultural explosion. How can I take a can myself? What if I drop it? What if I change my mind? But Clarence had calculated everything. He understood psychology. If a person holds something in their hands, the likelihood of them buying it increases tenfold. The rhythm of shopping changed forever. Listen, He invented things that today seem natural to us, like price tags. Before Saunders, there were no prices on goods. You would ask the seller, and he could name you any amount, looking at your shoes or hat. Clarence established fixed prices. He introduced shopping baskets. He even made cashiers wear uniforms to make the store look clean and professional. But do you know the most heartwarming part of this story? Clarence didn't just want to make money. He wanted to make food cheaper. Removing a legion of clerks, he was able to lower prices to the point where ordinary working families could finally afford delicacies. This was democracy in its purest form, packaged in a tin can. By the way, when he opened his first store, he threw an extravagant celebration. Music, flowers, and treats. He wanted the trip to get food to stop being a chore and become an adventure. And he succeeded. Within a few years, thousands of such mazes were operating across America. Do you know what the most ironic part is? The name Piggly Wiggly. When Clarence was asked why he named his empire that way, he would usually shrug and respond, "So you would ask me about it? A marketing genius. What more can I say?" So, are you heading to the store for milk today? Remember, every time you roll your cart between the aisles, you're following a route that was once conceived by a very audacious guy from Tennessee who decided that the customer was the master of their own experience. Sometimes, all it takes is to remove one barrier to open a pathway to a whole new world. Speaking of pathways that seem endless, we have a story in our archives about a man who thought he could build the longest and most unusual bridge in the world using only sunlight and his dream. And this bridge didn't connect shores, it connected centuries. Story number 26. The Stones That Move on Their Own. Have you ever felt someone behind you? You turn around and there's no one there. Just silence and emptiness. Imagine a place where that feeling becomes physical. A place where the very earth seems to be playing tricks on you. We're used to thinking of stones as symbols of stillness, a stronghold, static objects. But in one corner of our planet, the stones behave as if they have plans for the evening, and these plans include long strolls. Let's travel to the United States, California, Death Valley. The name sounds scary, right? But in reality, it's incredibly beautiful. There's a spot there, a dry lake bed called Racetrack Playa. An impeccably flat surface, cracked from the heat. The clay is as hard as concrete, and the silence is so profound that you can hear your blood pulsing in your ears. Now imagine, in the middle of this emptiness, there are stones, ordinary dolomite boulders. Some weigh as much as a decent microwave, while others are heavier than an adult, approaching 300 kilograms. And behind each of them lies a trail, a long, clear groove in the hard clay, stretching for dozens, even hundreds of meters. The tracks twist, turn at right angles, run parallel, or suddenly diverge in different directions. It looks like the stones were racing here while no one was watching. Here's the intrigue. For almost 100 years, no one, I emphasize no one, has ever seen them move. People have built the wildest theories, magnetic fields, the pranks of jokesters, extraterrestrials. Some even believe that the stones had some nascent consciousness. Scientists put up fences around the stones. The stones simply passed through them, not touching the grid, or just ignored the obstacles entirely. It became a true scientific deadlock. The rhythm of this prolonged mystery began to irritate researchers. And then, in 2014, imagine, just recently in terms of history, a group of scientists decided to take extreme measures. They brought their own stones with GPS sensors to the lake and set up time-lapse cameras. They waited for months. Silence. Heat. Nothing was happening. Then, well, wait. The answer didn't come from the heat, but from the cold. In winter, a rare rain fell on the lake. A thin layer of water covered the clay, and at night, frost hit. The scientists saw something incredible. The water froze, turning into gigantic yet extremely thin sheets of ice, literally like window glass. During the day, the sun began to warm up, the ice started to crack, and a gentle breeze, just a light breeze, began to push these ice fields. Imagine this physics. A vast area of ice has enormous sail-like properties. The ice pushes against the stone, Beneath the stone is slippery, softened clay. A stone weighing 300 kilograms begins to slowly crawl along the bottom at a speed of several centimeters per second. It leaves a groove that will freeze once the water evaporates. It was disappointingly simple yet simultaneously brilliant. Nature created the perfect mechanism that worked only when 1,000 conditions coincided. Rain is needed, frost is needed, ice of a certain thickness is needed, and sunlight is needed. If one of these conditions is missing, the stones remain in place. You know what's the funniest thing? Even after the mystery was revealed, people continue to visit Rezekpia because knowing how it works and seeing it with your own eyes are two completely different things. There, you still feel that the world is much more complex and whimsical than we think. But what? Did you feel how the ground beneath your feet can be somewhat less reliable than you thought? Sometimes even stones find a way to set off on a journey if they really want to. By the way, speaking of things that can change their form and surprise us, in our archive we have a story about how a very strange find in an ordinary garage led to a discovery that made people rethink the entire history of cuisine. And it was not about recipes, it was about how we perceive energy itself. Story number 27. A garden that never wilts and is not afraid of winter. Listen, do you love flowers? Not just enough to buy a bouquet at the Arch by the subway, but enough to stop in front of a petal, examining every delicate vein, every speck on the stamen. We are used to the idea that the beauty of nature is fleeting. It blooms in the morning and wilts by evening. That's the law. But imagine a place where spring has frozen forever. Not in the form of photographs or herbariums that turn into gray dust over time, but in the form of glass, clear, transparent, and absolutely vibrant in appearance. Let's transport ourselves to 1886, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University. Back then, botany professors were struggling. Seriously, how do you teach students if it's winter outside and you need to demonstrate the structure of a rare orchid? You either have dry, yellowing scraps in folders or awkward wax models that melt in the sun and look like melting ice cream. The precision is zero, and the aesthetics even less. It was at that moment that Professor George Lincoln Goodale heard about the astonishing craftsman from Bohemia, Leopold Rudolf Blaschka, father and son. To be honest, they were not scientists. They were hereditary glassblowers. You know, the kind who can blow glass into anything, from a wine glass to the most complex optical lenses. But they had a passion. They adored the sea. They began creating glass marine creatures, jellyfish, sea anemones, mollusks. Their work was so precise that biologists were left in awe. Goodale decided, I need them to create a garden for us. Imagine that rhythm of life, a small village near Dresden, a smoky workshop. The father and son sat across from each other, with only the flame of the torch and mountains of glass tubes between them. They worked together, without assistants, without apprentices. Silence. Just the hissing of the fire. They didn't just blow glass. Actually, wait a moment. They invented something more. They used lamp-working techniques, heating colored glass, pulling it into threads thinner than a human hair, coloring it from the inside with metallic oxides. They created fuzz on stems, pollen, traces of insect bites on leaves. If a leaf was supposed to have rust from a fungus, they made that rust out of glass. Listen, this was a titanic effort. For 50 years, they worked exclusively for Harvard. The result? 3,000 models, over 800 species of plants. When you walk into that museum hall, your head spins. You see a maple leaf that appears red from the autumn chill. You see a cactus with spines that look as if you could get pricked. And all of this glass is fragile, eternal, perfect. By the way, there was one mystery. Scientists spent decades trying to understand how they achieved such naturalism. Rumors circulated about secret glues, about magical additives. But when a chemical analysis was conducted in the late 20th century, it turned out that there were no secrets at all, just the purest craftsmanship and endless patience. Do you know what's most astonishing? When Rudolf, the last of the dynasty, finished his work, The secret of their craftsmanship died with him. No one was able to replicate it. Today we have lasers, printers, nanotechnology, but no one can make a glass flower so enticing that a bee would want to land on it. So, did you feel the fragility of this world? Sometimes, the hardest things are born from fire and the most fragile material in the world. The key is to have enough patience to see the beauty in every detail. Speaking of things that require precise craftsmanship and nerves of steel, we have a story in our archive about how a very strange find in an ordinary basement led to the creation of the most secure place on the planet. And it wasn't a government bunker. It was a place that housed what is worth more than any gold. Story number 28. An Arctic Ark for those who want to feed the future. Have you ever thought about what we will do if everything goes wrong? Not in the sense that you forgot your email password or missed the bus, but in terms of our entire civilization? We have become so accustomed to having food available in stores, apples year-round, bread every morning. This seems unshakable, but imagine a place built specifically to ensure that this order is never disrupted, even if complete chaos descends on the planet. Let's travel to Spitsbergen, Norway, 1,100 kilometers from the North Pole. Picture this landscape: permafrost, bare rocks wrapped in snow, the darkness of the polar night interrupted only by the northern lights. And right in the mountainside, you see something strange. A concrete portal, glowing with an otherworldly turquoise light. It looks like the entrance to a secret supervillain base from the movies. But inside, there are no rockets, no lasers. There are only seeds. This is the Global Seed Vault. It's called the Doomsday Vault. Listen, this is the most secure place on the planet. But the intrigue lies in the fact that its protection isn't just thick walls, it's nature itself. The seed chamber is located 120 meters inside the rock. Why so deep? So that even if all the electricity in the world goes out, the permafrost continues to function as a giant natural refrigerator. The rhythm of this place is silence and cold. The temperature is a constant -18 degrees Celsius. Inside, on metal shelves, lie millions of samples: rice from China, corn from Mexico, wheat from Russia. There are duplicates of nearly all the plants we eat. You know, it's like a backup of your life, but on a scale for all of humanity. If a disaster strikes a country, a drought, a flood, or even just an agricultural mistake, they can send a request and Spitsbergen will return their heritage. By the way, there was one story that proved this isn't just an expensive toy for scientists. Once, in Syria, due to conflict, the local seed bank became inaccessible. People lost access to unique plant varieties that had grown there for thousands of years. And so, for the first time in history, the Doomsday Vault opened its doors for distribution. Samples were sent back to Lebanon and Morocco so that scientists could restore the crops. It worked, you understand. The Ark saved a part of our shared past so that we have a future. But do you know what is the most touching part? There is no politics in Spitsbergen. Boxes from countries that may not even talk to each other in the ordinary world lie next to each other. Inside the mountain, they are just neighbors. Just people who want their children to know the taste of bread. The entrance to the vault is adorned with a mirror-glassed installation. It reflects the polar light during the day and glows itself at night. It's like a beacon, a symbol that even in the coldest and most desolate place, we can preserve what is truly dear to us. So, do you feel a bit more at ease about tomorrow? Sometimes the most important treasures are not gold bars, but tiny seeds hidden deep in the Arctic ice. Speaking of things that require incredible perseverance and the ability to keep secrets, we have a story in our archive about a man who decided he could deceive an entire army using only silence and his ability to vanish in plain sight. And it wasn't a ghost. It was just an ordinary person who really did not want to be found. Story number 29. The city that packed its bags and moved to a new location. So, have you ever moved? You know, that chaos. Boxes everywhere, tape that sticks in all the wrong places, and that old couch that just doesn't want to fit in the elevator. We usually spend a week looking for our favorite mug afterward. Now, imagine having to move not just furniture, but your entire city, complete with houses, hospitals, hotels, and even trees in the parks. Sounds like the ramblings of a crazy architect, right? But in Minnesota, 100 years ago, this became reality. Let's travel back to 1918, the city of Hibbing. At that time, it was called the iron capital of the world. The people there were tough and hardworking, and they lived, as it turned out, on a true treasure. Right beneath the foundations of their homes, under schoolyards, and beneath the main street, lay a gigantic vein of iron ore, the richest in history. The mining company took a look, calculated the profit, and, well, they approached the residents and said, "Guys, we have two pieces of news for you. The bad news? There's a lot of iron beneath your basements, and we need to dig it up. The good news? We are not going to demolish your city. We are just going to move it." Listen, this was an engineering adventure of biblical proportions. No, wait, it was even cooler. The intrigue lay in how to shift a brick building weighing 1,000 tons. In 1919, the Great Relocation began. Imagine the rhythm. Engineers dug out the foundations. They brought huge steel beams under the houses. Then, they placed the buildings on thousands of wooden rollers and crawler tractors. The city literally moved. The massive Colonial Hotel, over 50 meters long, was cut into two pieces, loaded onto platforms, and slowly pulled through the hills to a new location 2 miles away from the old one. People lined the roads, believing their own eyes. Imagine you are going to the store for bread, and your local library sways past you. But you know what's most astonishing about this? Life in Hibbing didn't stop. Workers managed to connect temporary water hoses and electrical wiring to the moving houses. It is said that in some offices, people continued to type documents and drink coffee while their building slowly crawled through the mud towards the new neighborhood. One woman even managed to bake a pie while her kitchen made the journey. Over 3 years, up until 1921, 185 buildings were relocated without a single serious damage. No panic. Just one city decided it was too good to tear down. By the way, in the new location, Hibbing became even more beautiful. The company built modern roads, a new school that looked like a palace, and a lovely park. People got more comfortable homes, and the company gained access to the ore, a rare case where everyone came out ahead. Today, in the spot where old Hibbing stood, a massive pit looms. But if you visit the new city, the locals will surely show you the traveling houses, the very same ones who once knew how to walk. So, did you feel that your moving problems are just child's play? Sometimes, to preserve what is dear to you, you need to not stand your ground, but to simply shift a little. Speaking of things that seem eternal but can disappear in the blink of an eye, we have a final story in our archive about how one person decided he could deceive nature itself by creating something that would live forever, requiring neither food, nor water, nor even sunlight. This is the story of the most unusual living creature ever seen by this world. Story number 30. The man who named the celestial ghosts. Have you ever tried to catch fog or describe in words the shape of smoke from a fire? It is impossible. It is chaos, pure changeability. Now imagine the sky. It is always above us, vast and constantly changing. For people of the past, clouds were just, well, clouds, ghosts that come and go. No one believed they could be classified. How can you name something that will turn into something completely different in 5 seconds? Let's travel back to the year 1802. London. The dusty attic of a pharmacy. There lives a young man named Luke Howard. Honestly, he is an ordinary pharmacist. He mixes powders, weighs ointments, and writes prescriptions for coughs. But his soul has always been behind the glass of the window. Since childhood, Luke was obsessed with the sky. He kept weather journals while other children played with toy soldiers. He sketched sunsets while his peers were learning Latin. And then one day, Luke realized, the sky is not chaos. It has its own language, its own system. But to understand it, one must stop looking at clouds as random blotches. Imagine that moment, the dim light of a candle. Luke sits at his desk, surrounded by his drawings. He understands that clouds are like living beings. They are born, grow, and disappear according to specific rules. He decides to use Latin, that very dead language, to bring the sky to life. He identifies three main categories. First, cirrus, the delicate clouds. Cirrus means curl or tendril, those thin, icy threads at great heights. Second, cumulus. Cumulus translates to heap or mass, those fluffy cotton candy mountains we love to draw in childhood. And third, stratus, layered cover, a gray, flat layer that blankets the entire sky. Listen, it was genius in its simplicity. When in December of the same year, Luke Howard presented his report at a small philosophical society, silence fell over the hall. People looked at him as if he had just tamed the wild ocean. He combined these terms, creating cumulus nimbus, those very thunderstorm clouds that tower. He gave us a vocabulary with which we began to understand the sky. The rhythm of science changed instantly. Even Goethe, the great poet and thinker, was so thrilled that he dedicated a cycle of poems to Luke Howard. He called him the man who tamed the clouds. Thanks to the humble pharmacist, meteorology transformed from divination in coffee grounds into a real science. But do you know what's most touching about this? Luke Govart has continued to work at his pharmacy. He was not in search of fame, nor did he demand awards. He was simply satisfied that now, when stepping outside and looking up, people saw not just white patches, they saw cirrus clouds, they saw stratus clouds. They began to notice beauty where before they only saw uncertainty. Well, our journey through the archives has come to an end. But do you know what the secret is? The archives are actually endless. Every day someone makes a small discovery, someone does a good deed, and someone simply looks up at the sky for the first time in a long while. Cherish that feeling of wonder. It is the most valuable thing we have. And the next time you see a fluffy cumulus cloud in the sky, just smile and remember the humble pharmacist from London who gave us that name. Thank you for joining us in this series. The world is full of wonders. You just need to know how to notice them. See you again in other stories. Look out the window. There lies an entire universe.